Hi, it's Norman again. Welcome back to this series on focal task specific dystonia, FTSD for short. In part 1, we zoomed in on the mechanism. We built the idea of task specific motor synergies, TSMSs, inside the primary motor cortex, M1. And we talked about how FTSD happens when one specific TSMS becomes hyperexcitable because its excitatory synapses are too strong compared to its fast, PV mediated inhibitory synapses. That mismatch is why symptoms only appear after you cross a specific movement intensity, the symptom threshold. In part 2, we answered the developmental how did this even happen question. We walked through technique changes, partial baseline shifts, true weakness, and then overreaching. We described how repeated practice above your current capacity can strengthen excitation in a biased way, while PV inhibition fails to keep up, eventually sculpting a dystonic synergy that takes over above the symptom threshold. Now we arrive at part 3, where we focus on the question that matters most. What does it take to cure FTSD, and how do you do it in practice? I'm going to lay out a mechanism informed rehabilitation approach I call below or at threshold retraining, BATR for short. I'll explain what it is, why it works in the brain, and then I'll give you a very practical guide for how to implement it in real life. Also, if you haven't watched parts 1 and 2 yet, I strongly recommend starting there, because this episode builds directly on the concepts from those videos. With that said, let's talk about the cure.
Once FTSD has arisen, manifesting as a TSMS in which PV-mediated inhibitory synapses are understrengthened relative to E synapses, we propose a specific motor retraining protocol, below or at threshold retraining, BATR for short. BATR is the systematic practice of the affected skilled movement strictly at or below the symptom threshold. We define the symptom threshold as the highest movement intensity that still produces clean, symptom-free performance. We propose that if applied correctly and for sufficient duration, BATR can serve as a curative intervention for FTSD by engaging STDP mechanisms to restore balance between excitation and inhibition within the affected TSMS. Under these conditions, motor retraining is directed to incrementally strengthen E, E, and I synapses in the residual functional synergy and critically the PV inhibitory synapses of the dystonic synergy itself, specifically the E and I synapses. In our framework, BATR functions by constraining every repetition of the skill to an intensity that remains free of dystonic contractions and lies within the current EI capacity of the functional synergy. At these levels, pyramidal neurons in M1 enter a stable firing regime in which each excitatory burst is strong enough to reliably depolarize local PV interneurons, yet doesn't overreach the excitatory circuit's current capacity, so firing remains coherent rather than becoming disorganized, partial burst patterns. Because PV interneurons require well-synchronized excitatory input to undergo LTP at E to I synapses and to deliver precise GABA A mediated I to E feedback, repeated practice below or at the symptom threshold provides exactly the presynaptic and postsynaptic timing needed to drive inhibitory plasticity. From a mechanistic standpoint, repeated coactivation in this clean intensity zone keeps the membrane potentials of pyramidal neurons and PV interneurons within the temporal windows required for STDP. E to I synapses strengthen when PV cells receive consistent, well-phased excitatory postsynaptic potentials from presynaptic pyramidal neurons and then fire action potentials that generate inhibitory postsynaptic currents back onto the same or closely related excitatory targets. Stable, non-fragmented pyramidal spike trains give PV interneurons well-defined, time-locked depolarizations, which in turn produce intracellular calcium transients through NMDA-type glutamate receptors or high-frequency suprathreshold depolarizations. These events are necessary for LTP at E to I synapses. Each short latency volley of PV-mediated inhibition returning to pyramidal somata further reinforces that tight temporal coupling between excitatory output and inhibitory feedback. Each correctly timed episode of pyramidal and PV spiking also engages plasticity-related proteins such as CAMK2, CAMK4, and PKC in both presynaptic and postsynaptic compartments. Within PV interneurons, these cascades promote GABA A receptor clustering at their terminals onto pyramidal cells and increase presynaptic release probability at GABAergic synapses, which together enlarge the amplitude and reliability of inhibitory postsynaptic currents. As these changes accumulate, the previously compromised I to E synapses within the synergy recover the ability to clamp excitatory surges at progressively higher intensities. The symptom threshold for involuntary dystonic firing is pushed upward as the inhibitory circuit strengthens. At the network level, inhibitory circuitry in M1 is only partially segregated across synergies. We propose that a subset of PV interneurons participating in the functional synergy also receive input from and project back to pyramidal neurons that belong to the dystonic synergy. These shared inhibitory cells link neighboring excitatory ensembles for the same digit. When the functional synergy is repeatedly recruited in a well-timed, high-fidelity manner during BATR, it drives strong E to I input onto these PV interneurons, which then fire robustly and send I to E output not only to the functional pyramidal population, but also to overlapping or neighboring pyramidal neurons in the dystonic ensemble. Even though the dystonic synergy's excitatory subcircuit remains silent at and below symptom threshold speeds, every clean practice trial still generates a coincident burst of excitation in shared PV cells and a matched inhibitory volley into the broader M1 region. Over time, this synchronized activity strengthens E to I and I to E synapses in the inhibitory circuit of the dystonic synergy as well. Thus, the key insight is that this partial overlap in local inhibitory cells allows BATR to act on both synergies at once. Each at or below threshold repetition maintains and enhances the functional synergy's EI balance while simultaneously providing the dormant inhibitory circuit of the dystonic synergy with exactly the frequency and timing of PV coactivation needed to grow its synaptic strength. Because the performer never exceeds the symptom threshold to engage the dystonic excitatory circuit, those excitatory synapses aren't further potentiated. Instead, PV interneurons remain strongly and repeatedly engaged within the normal synergy with ample bursts, calcium signaling, and capture of plasticity-related proteins so their GABA A output onto dystonic pyramidal neurons can gradually catch up. Across many practice sessions, the inhibitory circuit of the dystonic synergy strengthens until its synaptic strength equals that of the dystonic excitatory circuit, restoring the E to I ratio toward equilibrium within the maladaptive TSMS. Once local PV interneurons can deliver robust, short latency inhibition that matches the dystonic excitatory drive, increases in movement intensity no longer produce the runaway bursts characteristic of FTSD, as emerging pyramidal bursts are immediately curtailed and cortical hyperexcitability and involuntary posturing are prevented. Clinically, the symptom threshold progressively shifts upward. Dystonic contractions gradually disappear, and the performer can operate at intensities that previously provoked symptoms without recruiting the involuntary synergy. Through BATR, M1 reestablishes the temporal synchrony between excitation and inhibition. The functional synergies EI circuits continue to strengthen through LTP, and via shared PV interneurons, the dystonic synergy's previously weak inhibitory circuit also undergoes LTP. In principle, this process can reverse the maladaptive plastic changes that define FTSD and allow a complete, lasting recovery. BATR relies on strict adherence to performing your affected motor task while not triggering dystonic symptoms. Whether you're a musician, writer, vocalist, athlete, or any other practitioner whose craft hinges on refined motor skills, the same neuroplastic principles apply. You must locate and remain at or below the symptom threshold while carefully and gradually expanding that threshold once the inhibitory circuit has begun to catch up. In practice, the first step is to identify the highest task intensity at which your dystonic symptoms vanish. Using the definition of movement intensity from video 1, the goal is to locate your symptom threshold in your specific domain. Practically, that means finding the highest intensity you can execute cleanly and symptom-free, which will look slightly different depending on your specific skill. For a pianist, this means determining your maximal keystroke force at which playing remains clean and symptom-free. For laryngeal dystonia, also known as spasmodic dysphonia, this means determining your maximum speech volume that remains symptom-free, often in the range of whispering or very soft phonation. For a writer, this means identifying the greatest writing speed or pen pressure that remains symptom-free. And for an athlete, this means identifying the highest movement speed, force output, or training load within the specific sport movement while keeping the movement clean and symptom-free. Once you've identified your symptom threshold, the recovery process begins with long daily practice sessions, ideally with minimal breaks and interruptions, devoted to executing the movement precisely at or below this clean intensity. Your aim is consistently accurate movement repetitions with zero dystonic symptoms. Mechanistically, your goal is to generate repeated, well-timed coactivation of pyramidal cells and PV interneurons so that the adaptive synaptic strengthening described earlier can accumulate. Next, it's important to be explicit about what improvement means in BATR. Because your dystonic symptoms are governed by a symptom threshold, improvement in your FTSD means that this threshold has shifted upward. In other words, the highest movement intensity at which you can perform the task cleanly and symptom-free is now higher than it was before. That definition matters because it tells you exactly when and how to adjust intensity. During BATR, you practice at or below your current symptom threshold. You should only increase your attempted intensity during BATR when you feel improvement in your FTSD, which means your symptom threshold has moved upward, and even then, you should only increase your attempted intensity up to the exact movement intensity of your new, higher symptom threshold. Practically, this means that your attempted intensity for BATR is always anchored to the highest intensity you can currently execute with zero dystonic symptoms, and you only increase intensity to the extent that your symptom-free limit has moved upward. You may notice this upward shift during a practice session, between sessions, or only after multiple sessions. Regardless of when you notice it, the rule is the same. Only increase your attempted intensity during BATR when you experience improvement, which is when the symptom threshold has moved up, and only increase it up to your new symptom threshold, which is your new highest movement intensity that is still completely clean and symptom-free. After you increase your attempted intensity to match your new symptom threshold, apply a simple verification rule. the movement must remain completely clean and symptom-free. If dystonic symptoms appear at the new intensity, that's evidence that you have exceeded your new, higher symptom threshold, meaning the intensity you chose is above the highest level you can currently execute cleanly after the improvement you observed. In that situation, immediately reduce intensity to the highest level that's clean and symptom-free, which is your new, higher symptom threshold, and continue practicing at or below that movement intensity so that every repetition remains completely symptom-free. This process is cyclical. First, you identify your symptom threshold, which also defines the clean, symptom-free intensity range at and below that threshold. Next, you practice within that range with high repetition and high precision so that every repetition remains completely clean and symptom-free. Then, once you observe improvement, meaning your symptom threshold has shifted upward, you increase your attempted intensity only up to the exact movement intensity of your new symptom threshold, and you continue practicing at or below that level. Repeating this cycle systematically strengthens the inhibitory circuit of the dystonic synergy and strengthens both the excitatory and inhibitory circuits of the functional synergy. In addition, it's essential to approach BATR with patience. To cure FTSD by rebalancing excitation and inhibition, you need large repetition counts distributed over consistent daily practice. This process generally requires weeks to potentially months of continuous daily retraining, with a practical target of approximately 3 to 6 hours of BATR per day, ideally with minimal breaks and interruptions. In the early stages, progress may feel slow or negligible for days, and sometimes for weeks. If you follow BATR strictly and carefully, you progressively shrink the excitation-inhibition gap that underlies the dystonia. Over time, your symptom threshold continues to shift upward, allowing you to perform at progressively higher intensities with fully normal control. As the threshold rises, it eventually meets and then surpasses the intensity demands of normal performance for your task. And with continued retraining, the excitatory and inhibitory circuits continue to rebalance until they're fully rebalanced, at which point dystonic symptoms resolve completely. A central point to understand is that BATR should, in theory, be universally applicable to all forms of FTSD, provided that a symptom threshold can be identified, thereby defining a symptom-free intensity range at the threshold and below it. The fundamental mechanism, properly and consistently engaging shared PV interneurons without reinforcing high excitability loops, shouldn't differ in any essential way across individuals with FTSD. Therefore, if your progress feels slow or insufficient, in our framework, it doesn't mean that BATR doesn't work for your case. In most situations, variability reflects either 1, a breakdown in practice conditions, or 2, an insufficient duration of practice. 2 common failure modes are especially important. First, overshooting your new, higher symptom threshold after improvement. After you observe improvement, you may increase attempted intensity, but only up to the exact movement intensity of your new symptom threshold. If you increase beyond that level and dystonic symptoms appear, that's evidence that you have exceeded your new symptom threshold and re-engaged the dystonic synergy. When that happens, you're no longer giving the PV inhibitory circuit the consistent, well-timed activation it needs for inhibitory strengthening to accumulate. Second, practicing too briefly or inconsistently. If sessions are short or irregular, your circuits may not receive enough consistent excitation inhibition coactivation for Hebbian plasticity to accumulate and rebalance the system. To manage these risks, you should monitor adherence with objective detail. On a daily basis, keep note of the intensity level you practiced at during BATR and the total time you practiced completely symptom-free. dystonic symptoms shouldn't occur during correct BATR. If they do occur at any point, record that as well because it indicates you exceeded your symptom threshold. This kind of tracking helps you determine whether you're truly meeting the criteria for correct BATR execution. In essence, the key requirement is simple. Your BATR practice must remain completely symptom-free, repeated with a high repetition count, and carried out consistently day after day. By doing that, you're directly engaging the neuroplastic mechanisms that should restore balanced synaptic strengths between the excitatory circuit and the inhibitory circuit, which is the mechanism by which BATR cures FTSD. Now that we've covered the mechanism, the developmental cause, and the curative intervention, let's summarize the main ideas from this three-part sequence. First, the mechanism. FTSD is best understood as a task-specific, intensity-dependent breakdown in the excitation-inhibition balance inside a particular TSMS in M1. The key deficit is PV-centered fast inhibition that is understrengthened relative to excitation, which is why symptoms appear abruptly above a specific symptom threshold. Second, the developmental cause. FTSD typically emerges through a sequence. A major technique change can reduce effective capacity through a partial baseline shift. That reduced capacity can present as true weakness above a true weakness threshold. If you repeatedly overreach above your current capacity, plasticity becomes biased so that excitation strengthens more than PV inhibition, and a dystonic synergy is sculpted above the symptom threshold. Third, the cure. Below or at threshold retraining, BATR is designed to reverse the imbalance by keeping practice strictly in the symptom-free zone so that inhibitory synapses can strengthen with the correct timing. As inhibitory capacity increases, the symptom threshold rises, and the goal is to progressively reclaim normal intensity demands without triggering dystonia. The main message I want you to leave with is this. FTSD isn't random, and it isn't inherently permanent. In this framework, it reflects a specific, task-bound imbalance between excitatory drive and PV-mediated inhibition within the TSMS that controls the affected movement in M1. Because synaptic strengths in these circuits remain plastic, strict BATR can drive a targeted, activity-dependent strengthening of PV-mediated inhibitory function within the affected TSMS. Specifically, repeated symptom-free activation at or below the symptom threshold provides the timing and repetition needed for strengthening of the excitatory to inhibitory and inhibitory to excitatory synapses that implement fast, short latency GABA-A inhibitory control. As these PV-mediated synapses strengthen, inhibitory efficacy increases, the excitation-inhibition mismatch within the TSMS is reduced, and the symptom threshold progressively shifts upward. With sufficient symptom-free repetitions performed consistently over time, the symptom threshold can increase to the point that normal performance intensities no longer trigger dystonic contractions. In that state, inhibition and excitation are functionally rebalanced within the TSMS, and recovery is complete.